Hello everyone, I'm Santiago and today I'm gonna be testing Dark Souls Remastered on the GeForce GTX 1050 Ti. For performance monitoring, I'll be using CAM. If you want to download the software, there's a link down in the description. So Dark Souls Remastered, I'll be doing 1080p, 1440p and 4K. To skip any of those sections of the video, check the description below. So first, I'll show you 1080p on the G4560, and since the maximum frame rate possible is 60 frames per second, I just kept VSync on. It doesn't make sense to have capped frame rates and no VSync, at least in my opinion. Then after that I switched to the i3 8100 and I test the same thing on 1080p, but you won't notice any difference at all. This game doesn't use the extra CPU power, and since we cannot go beyond 60 frames per second, we won't see a difference CPU wise in this case. A G4560 is more than enough to run this game at 60 frames per second. Then I switched to 1440p and I used the same settings, maximum settings, without any problems whatsoever. We have some GPU power to spare, it runs at 60 frames per second. And finally at 4K I show you two configurations. First I show you with FXAA high, depth of field enabled and ambient occlusion enabled, just to show you that we can be over 30 frames per second without any issues. And then I just lower everything to the minimum, which means I turn off anti-aliasing, motion blur, depth of field and ambient occlusion, and in that case we are pretty much over 50 frames per second the majority of the time. But when there are some enemies on screen attacking at you at the same time, or there are a lot of fire effects on screen, for example the gargoyle boss fight, that can be a big performance hit. It can drop below 40 frames per second very easily in those cases. But general gameplay overall is at 50 to 60 frames per second. So in this case I would recommend playing at 1440p or 1080p. The game just tests at 60 frames per second without any problems, but 4K is still an option if you want to play at that resolution. In the options menu we have very little options. We got vertical sync, anti-aliasing, motion blur, depth of field and ambient occlusion, pretty much. The good thing about this one compared to the Prepare to Die edition, you can change this in-game, so you don't have to restart the game going to INI file for this fix. So that's good, we can compare performance very easily. It also supports ultra wide resolutions. I tested that myself. It's just the original version with some small graphical improvements plus some optimizations for modern hardware, for saying it some way. So it's capped at 60 frames per second. You cannot go over 60. That's why I enable VSync on all the videos in this game. Since we cannot go over 60, it doesn't make much sense to me to disable VSync. And well, the most demanding options so far, since we have so little, pretty much all of them have some sort of small impact. On my end so far, the most demanding options were anti-aliasing and ambient occlusion. Usually those two are the ones that make the difference. Then in places where you can see very far into the distance, for example Firelink Shrine, depth of field has a bigger impact in performance, but nothing too drastic. Motion blur in this case seems to be camera motion blur, which in my opinion is very annoying. I get kinda dizzy using it. I used it anyway, so you can see how it goes, but it's not a big performance impact, so be aware of that. If you already own this game, I wouldn't really consider rebuying it at 50% off, maybe wait for a deeper sale, but I agree with most people. This should have been a patch for the previous edition, the Prepare to Die edition. It runs a lot better. So far it has the fixes for the frame rate. So they fixed the physics, they fixed Blighttown, which is wonderful, and they also got rid of the stutter that happened constantly on the previous edition, at least on my end. So yeah, the game runs a lot better, much more stable. So my testing methodology here is going from Blighttown to the Undead Berg, or the other way around, it depends. Sometimes I did the opposite direction. As I said, Blighttown is fixed, so it runs a lot better, but overall the biggest performance hits were when a boss uses a fire effect on you. For example the gargoyles, those can be a big impact in performance. So if you have a lot of GPU power to spare on Blighttown, for example on Blighttown you get 80% GPU usage or 70%, that's usually enough to deal with the fire effects. For example on my 1050 Ti video, that's the case at 1440p and below, but at 4K and Blighttown I get 99% GPU usage, still 60 frames per second, but once you fight the gargoyles you might get 30 frames per second when fire shows up, so that's something to keep in mind. There's also some minor stutter sometimes when traveling through areas. Not really a big deal if you ask me. It happens to me on Dark Souls 3 as well. But yeah guys, that's pretty much it. I hope you keep enjoying the video. Thanks for watching and see you next time.